Welcome to episode 70. You are trapped in history with me, history teacher Robbie Malcolmson. This episode will focus on 20th century global conflicts. So this is especially helpful in summarizing some of the main themes and events of Unit 8 in AP European history. This episode is an attempt to build off of the last one in which I focused on Unit 7, and episode 71 will be a narrative focus on wrapping up the school year in AP European history with Unit 9. Again, this is a narrative focus on this particular time period. And from 1914 to present day, Europe is no longer the uncontested center of the world. Instead, it becomes the battleground where empires fall, ideologies rise, and a new global order emerges within the Cold War. Now, by the onset of the 20th century into 1914, Europe was mostly industrialized, connected by railroads, trade, and diplomacy, as well as many secret and not-so-secret alliances. However, beneath all of the progress of industrialization, progress since the Enlightenment in Unit 4, there are causes of World War I, which are often simply or simplified into an acronym referred to as MAIN, and me and my team teacher will refer to it sometimes as mania, because we will often include industrialization and assassination into the direct and indirect causes of World War I. One of those in Maine we focused on in the last two episodes on Trapped in History, which is nationalism. Nationalism fuels this sense of nation statehood, this sense of national identity. We saw that bring Germans together and Italians together to form nation states there in the middle to late 1800s, the 19th century, but now we're going to see it radicalized even more into World War I and World War II. Imperialism, that was also mentioned in the last podcast, that will also further drive competition amongst the European powers, especially for finding raw materials, opening up new markets, spreading your ideologies, and I guess just your overall influence. And topics like social Darwinism were used to just morally justify those actions in events like the Scramble for Africa, places in like India, Vietnam, and other locations. Militarism, especially most directly here, is going to be used as well, not just with Bismarck, but all the way into World War I as a way to physically build up a military, getting it ready for war, and also as an attempt to glorify war. And when the great powers of Europe start becoming to do that, along with nationalism, imperialism, and alliances, this is going to turn what could be seemingly smaller, more regional conflicts into a massive great war, a war to end all wars. So with all these is kind of making up a recipe for a perfect concoction or a perfect storm of a situation. It builds up even more tension in Europe, especially in southeastern Europe, where we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire and we have a territory of Serbia. And I say that specifically because with all this tension, this area was kind of fueled into that, was often nicknamed the Balkan powder keg, the area of the Balkans, like we mentioned in the previous episode. And what starts and ignites the Great War is something that teachers often state as the spark. And this is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the future leader of Austro-Hungarian throne. Him and his wife are killed by Gavrilo Princip and the other members of the Black Hand. And this will get Serbia blamed for the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And then behind that, there'll be a support of Germany basically writing a blank check to Austria-Hungary to say, if you want to declare war here, we would support you. And this is again the beginning of how a traumatic, like smaller event can then fuel a greater sized one. And then we get this concept again. Europe was built. Or at least throughout the 1800s, it had built a system so fragile, and that this one event could just come crashing down on that the concert of Europe agreed upon and Congress of Vienna, all the issues building through the 1800s, the 99 years of since the Congress of Vienna, you're going to see the start of World War One. And World War One becomes truly the first ever total war. And you may ask as a new teacher or as a student, what is total war? And I'll often reference this in class, and I'll use this with my multiple choice Mondays and other primary source activities. And I think I'll mess up the gentleman's name, but I think it's Giulio Douhet or Douhet. I could be just completely mispronouncing that. But the primary source, I'm going to put this on the show notes. And from the point of view of this particular gentleman, he's an Italian general, and he is the father of strategic air power. And he publishes this in 1921, shortly after World War One. And this is, I actually saw this referenced in the book Masters of the Air. For this particular author in The Command of the Air, he wrote and explained his own logic that I think best sums up from a primary source what total war is and why it is justified from his point of view. He states, war is no longer a clash between armies, but it is a clash between nations, between whole populations. Any distinction between belligerents and non-belligerents is no longer admissible, because when nations are at war, everyone takes part in it. The soldier carrying the gun, the woman loading shells in a factory, the farmer growing wheat, the scientist in his laboratory. The limitations applied to the so-called inhuman and atrocious means of war are nothing but international demagogic hypocrisies. Total war has to be regarded unemotionally as a science, regardless of how terrible a science. Isn't that a hell of a bone-chilling sort of description here, and definitely foreshadows the narrative summary here of World War One and going into World War II. Like I said, it's one of my favorite sources that I use in class. You can see that in the show notes if you get a chance to look during while you're listening to this. And again, I would be more than happy to share this assignment with any of you. Now, on top of this note of total war, it's a great segue into how governments during this time, they will regulate, influence, and in some cases, or many of them, they will take control of the economies in order to enact total war. Factories shift to weapons production, women are entering the workforce in massive numbers, and the battlefield itself transforms. New inventions like machine guns cut down soldiers by thousands, poison gas introduces terror in the trenches, and tanks attempt to break the deadlock, the stalemate of the war. But nothing breaks the stalemate quickly. Instead, millions die, often for just yards or miles of land. And here's the question that we have to wrestle with philosophically, hence wrestling with history that I often use. And the question we could ask is, or to our students, how did a civilization that prided itself on progress, especially since the Enlightenment, especially since the Industrial Revolution, produce such destruction? How did a civilization that prided itself on progress produce such destruction? Now, wrestling with this question forces us to confront a central paradox of the age of modernity. The same industrial and scientific advances that improved life also made destruction more efficient and impersonal. The Second Industrial Revolution did not just produce steel and electricity, it produced machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons. European leaders believed in progress, yet they also embraced militarism and radical nationalism, creating a culture where war was not only possible, but to some, inevitable. This raises a deeper philosophical issue. Is progress truly progress if it expands humanity's capacity for violence? Or does technological advancement simply amplify whatever values, good or bad, already exist in a society? And I think that we can obviously see this throughout Unit 9 after the advent and the use of the atomic bomb and the proliferation of nuclear weapons into the arms race of the Cold War, all the way into today. Oh, if you look at things like drone warfare or ballistic missiles, any of these other kind of technologies, or even the use of AI as potentially a military weapon if it hasn't already been used as one. Now, on the topic of World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, other key events also take place, such as the Armenian genocide by the hands of the Ottomans and the Russian Revolution of 1917 that results in the removal of the Tsar and the eventual rise of communism, culminating in 1922, which changes it to the Soviet Union or the USSR, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Now let's start within that Russian Revolution of 1917. While the war rages on in World War I, one empire cannot hold on, and that being Russia. Dealing with economic and social inequality, the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, Russia strained by military defeat, economic hardship, and political instability, and it all culminates into beginning a collapse on Nicholas II and the Romanov family there. And this will result in the last Tsar in Russian history. Now, in 1917, revolution erupts, and out of that chaos emerges a new ideology started by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, as we saw that book being published there around 1848, 1849. But Lenin will take it and create Leninism, his own kind of version of Marxism. And again, the Russian Revolution, led by, leading to a provisional government, but then later on we see it led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who seized power, promising the people of Russia peace, land, and bread. This is not just a change in government, it is a complete rejection of the old order, of monarchy, of capitalism and traditional hierarchy. Russia becomes the first communist state, later evolving into the Soviet Union, and now Europe and the world faces a new kind of conflict, not just between nations, but between ideologies. Now, if you teach AP World History, this is where we're going to see it eventually spread into Mao's China later on. We get into Vietnam, into Korea, into Cuba, lots of other places in the world in which communism spreads, or at least socialism starts to proliferate a little bit more. And again, we have a philosophical question in this section on the Russian Revolution we could wrestle with, and that could be, what could happen when ideology replaces tradition? And again, I think it feeds really well or builds really well off of the concerns that many Europeans had coming out of Unit 7 from our last podcast on episode 69. Now, in regards to that question, what could happen when ideology replaces tradition? When ideology replaces it, it offers clarity, purpose, and a vision for the future, but often at the cost of complexity and dissent amongst the people. The Bolsheviks rejected centuries of Russian monarchy and social hierarchy, replacing them with a system rooted in Marxist communist ideology. Yet in doing so, they created a new form of authority that demanded absolute loyalty. This transformation challenges us to consider whether revolutions truly liberate societies or simply exchange one form of control for another. We could ask, can an ideology that promises equality avoid becoming authoritarian at all? Or does the pursuit of a perfect system, a utopian system, inevitably justify coercion and violence, especially the restriction of natural rights? Now, moving on to another event that started within the World War I, fog of war period, was in 1915. If we go to the Ottoman Empire, we're going to go touch base on now the Armenian genocide. And again, this section here, this narrative, can be guided by wrestling with another philosophical thought question: when does war become a justification for annihilation? As the Great War unfolds from 1914 to 18, the violence is not limited to the trenches in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe. Within the weakening of the Ottoman Empire, another kind of violence emerges, one that has been building and has been off and on violent for many decades. One that, in this case, targets not enemy soldiers, but an entire group of people. One that will become a blueprint for Hitler's Holocaust. This is the Armenian Genocide, and it begins in 1915 as the Ottoman government, led in part by the Young Turks, accuses Armenian Christians of disloyalty and collaboration with Russia. But these accusations are not simply about wartime security. They are rooted in rising ethnic nationalism and a desire to create a more homogenous, uniform state. Or as Hitler will later call this, like an Aryan state. But this would be different, not Aryan in terms of like a white German like we see later on. Now, Armenians, in this process, they will be arrested, deported, and forced on death marches through the Syrian desert. Families are separated, communities are entirely erased. An estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenians die through starvation, violence, and exhaustion. This is not collateral damage in a war. This is not accidental. This is one of the first ever modern genocides. It was done by the government systematically in an organized way and carried out under the cover of the total war of World War I. And it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question: when does war stop being about survival and become a justification for annihilation? To truly wrestle, I think, with the Armenian genocide, it means that we have to recognize how easily fear, nationalism, cultural, social, and religious tension, social Darwinism, and the complexities in the fog of war can combine to justify targeting an entire population or populations in general. In times of crisis, like war or economic instability or internal strife or sectarian violence, governments often frame violence as necessary for security. Force equals control, and control means maybe safety at the expense of freedoms. But in this case, it shows how that logic can be extended to the extremes, where suspicion becomes accusation, which became a catalyst for attempted extermination of Armenian Christians and secular Armenians. It challenges us to consider how topics like language and ideology can dehumanize groups, making violence seem acceptable or even necessary. The deeper philosophical issue is not just why this happened, but how ordinary structures of authority, government, military bureaucracy, for example, can be used to carry out extraordinary violence. It raises a question that echoes throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. What safeguards, if any, can prevent a state from turning against its own people? After these key events, after the Great War, again, not called World War I yet, these people do not know that World War II will happen. When the war to end all wars ends, when the Russian Revolution ends, when the Armenian Genocide ends, after the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll get to, we enter these, what's called the interwar periods. And again, the Great War ends in 1918. The Versailles Conference, the Treaty of Versailles, will be ratified and completed in 1919, forcing this onto Germany. And again, the Treaty of Versailles punishes Germany, forcing them to pay reparations and damages for the war, territorial losses, military restrictions, even a war guilt clause in which they must accept publicly blame for the war, even though Austria-Hungary and Serbia had sparked the beginning of the war. At the same time, new nations are created across Europe based on what's called self-determination, and we see that into nationalism and decolonization in Unit 9, which will be on our next episode, on episode 71. But these new borders in Europe after World War I, they're messy, and again, big surprise. another conflict ends and you're trying to change up borders again. Very similar to what we saw at the end of the Congress of Vienna. Ethnic groups throughout Europe will continue to be divided. Economies are unstable, which begins to make democracy and capitalism look a little less appealing. Resentment grows. Then, after the crash in America on the stock market in 1929, comes within it the Great Depression. Due to globalization of the world markets, economic collapse spreads across Europe, especially in Germany, where they were experiencing hyperinflation through the mid-20s and onward. Unemployment will rise, and in that moment of crisis, people start to ask questions like, what if democracy isn't strong enough? We have seen radical solutions to failed government stability and economic growth. And this question cuts through the heart of the interwar period of 1919 to 1938. Democracy depends on stability, trust, and participation, but the Treaty of Versailles, economic instability, and the Great Depression undermine all three of these characteristics. In moments of fear and uncertainty, people often prioritize order over freedom, turning toward leaders who promise decisive action, which leads to the rise of authoritarian or totalitarian regimes who suggest that democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires instead active defense and public faith. This raises a difficult philosophical question for both past and present. Is democracy inherently fragile? And if so, what conditions are necessary to preserve it in times of crisis? And again, as Americans, we're seeing in 2026, often on many different times of crisis. This main philosophical question, again, opens the door for totalitarianism. Again, we see that continuing on through Lenin into Stalin. We see it with fascism, with Mussolini first, into Hitler, and then into Franco in Spain. So there are going to be some shifts now in some of these European powers to a less democratic way in order to find that stability and that growth. And it's going to be further fueled by nationalism of the last two episodes that we've discussed. Now let's dive a little bit further into totalitarianism and authoritarian governments and the rise of fascism, which has often been an essay topic or a short answer topic on a lot of past AP exams. Let's start with fascism. In Italy, you have a leader like Benito Mussolini who establishes fascism, which is a system built on extreme nationalism, authoritarian control, and militarism. And again, another way to think of it is this, is that in fascism, the needs of the state come before the needs of the individual, and you glorify the state of war. In Germany, the situation is even more volatile. Economic hardship from hyperinflation, national humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, and political instability create the perfect conditions for the rise of someone radical like Adolf Hitler. Hitler promises restoration of national German pride, power, and identity. But his ideology is rooted in racism and exclusion. And we even see this again in 1925 and past that, whenever he is, after the beer hall push, after he is thrown into jail or in prison, and he begins to write and publish Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And he makes it very clear about this need for an identity, about blaming a lot of the hardships and downfall on Jews and other people that are not part of the Aryan kind of German race here. And this will be further used to fuel the onset of the Holocaust all the way into what we know as the final solution for what Hitler calls the Jewish question or the Jewish problem. And to continue on here with him, as I have previewed in past episodes about the eventual rise of Hitler, his version of nationalism is taken to the most extreme. I always tell students it's probably one of the most harshest versions of radical nationalism that we've ever seen in human history. And again, with Hitler's, we have the belonging is defined by race, and those who do not belong are then targeted. Hitler quickly begins to ignore military restrictions of the Versailles Treaty in 1919, most likely well aware of the weakness posed by the attempted League of Nations, who lacked a standing army, who lacked a role from the U.S. involvement, and more importantly, it was filled with countries who hoped to avoid another great war at all cost. Meanwhile, over in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, another totalitarian leader, consolidates even more power onto himself through his great purges, through propaganda and control, through collectivization, and his treatment of the kulaks that are there. Different ideologies, but the same result, total control over society. So again, it doesn't matter if it's fascism or communism, it is often into that total control, forming what's important onto the state. And again, this is totalitarianism. This is authoritarianism. We could ask ourselves here, when does nationalism become dangerous? In my opinion, nationalism becomes dangerous when it shifts from inclusion to exclusion, when it defines not just who belongs, but who must be removed. In fascist regimes, nationalism was fused with identity, race, and loyalty to the state, creating a system where dissent was betrayal and difference was a threat. This transformation reveals how easily a unified idea can become a tool of division and force and fear. The philosophical tension lies in the boundary. At what point does pride in one's nation become hostility towards others? And who decides where that line is drawn? We are wrestling with that in our society now. I would say in the 2000s, in the 21st century, we have wrestled with this off and on, and especially going into the year 2026 now and into 2027. Now let's get a little bit closer into World War II, kind of getting close to that now. And again, you can just see how incredibly important and large and difficult this unit is. This unit is just so packed with so many key events. I remember when I was first teaching AP European history, I was so, I just kind of sat there wondering, how in the heck am I going to teach this in 2.5 to 3 weeks? How am I going to be able to hit all these key moments? And enough on a level where students can write about it and speak about it in a nuanced or complex way. And it has really taken years to figure out, okay, what I want to do is I'm going to focus more on the main themes of the unit, which is what really this episode is doing. And then in the future, I can kind of hit on more specific topics as we go, or in review, you can do a little bit more of that. So let's move into, as we're getting closer to World War II, and let's focus a little bit more on Hitler. As Hitler begins expanding Germany's territory, Western powers respond with, instead of force to stop him, they respond with what's called appeasement, hoping to avoid another devastating war. They allow him to, for example, remilitarize the Rhineland, which is there in Western Germany, to annex Austria, a German-speaking people, to the south of Germany, and to take parts of Czechoslovakia, like the Sudetenland, known for its oil fields, perfect for, militarizing, building one of the strongest and biggest militaries in history. All of this is also being done against the demands of the Treaty of Versailles. And this is something that Hitler felt like he was willing to do, that the Weimar Republic, under the Second Reich of Germany, was not willing to do. And since Hitler's chancellorship in 1933 into 1935, when he became a little bit more, I guess you'd say, a lot more executive power there, this is what's going to push him forward. And don't forget, too, for context, Hitler also helps to prove his loyalty with fascism, with Mussolini in 1936, when we see the Spanish Civil War, when Francisco Franco with Mussolini and Hitler both getting involved in that war, helping Franco further consolidate power onto himself. But let's go back on that topic of appeasement. Let's revisit that with an important question. Was appeasement a mistake, or was it just a desperate attempt to preserve peace? And in 1938, Chamberlain from Great Britain comes back and Does the speech of peace for our time that we believe we have avoided a greater conflict, even though it came at the expense of Czechoslovakian land and resources? They felt kind of a proud way, especially Chamberlain, that a war had been avoided. But it is very clear that Hitler this whole entire time had planned to not only take over Europe, but as much of the world as he could. And he's just kind of testing the League of Nations over and over for as long as he can until I think he feels like really war is inevitable. And I think he wants to be able to fight war on his watch and in his style. Hence the famous method called blitzkrieg. So because by 1939, it became extremely clear that at this point, war is unavoidable. Appeasement, it forces us to evaluate decisions that we make all the time under pressure, under uncertainty and the shadow of past trauma that we have. You know, after World War I, now we can call it that, European leaders were deeply aware of the cost of war. And avoiding another conflict, it seemed not just practical, but moral. However, in attempting to preserve that peace, they allowed aggression to grow unchecked with Hitler and Mussolini. This dilemma highlights the complexity, the nuance of leadership. Decisions are rarely made with perfect information, and mortal intentions do not always produce moral positive outcomes. It challenges us to consider whether peace can be maintained through compromise or whether some threats must be confronted even at great risk. I think that is a time to transition to one of my favorite topics in history to study since college onward, and that is really the beginning of World War II. World War II begins with blitzkrieg. In other words, a lightning war by Hitler. Germany will move quickly, overwhelming the state of Poland and much of Europe. Stalin will also attack into that eastern side of Poland with part of their agreement secretly on the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. But, unlike the first war, this war is going to be different. It is truly global. It is ideological. And it is even more destructive than the first war from 1914 to 18. Civilians now are direct targets, especially with carpet bombing. Cities are bombed, places like London and other cities by the Germans are targeted. Eventually, even the Americans and the British will resort to daylight and nighttime, like round-the-clock bombing, and eventually just plain targeting cities and trying to break the morale of the enemy. And again, cities are bombed, annihilated, entire populations are mobilized. And it's one of those times where we can sometimes focus a little too much on the atomic bombs, but they are extremely devastating. But we cannot also overlook just the enormous amount of casualties that were done in just carpet bombing and other types of targeting cities and just their entire population on both sides. And at the center of the war is one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews are systematically murdered along with millions of others, Roma, disabled individuals, political opponents, homosexuals, etc. This is genocide, organized, executed by a modern state, and it forces us to confront one of the hardest questions philosophically in history. And again, this was inspired even more so from the Armenian genocide. And we can ask the question, how can ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil? There are many books about this too. I think there's a great book called Ordinary Men, which really focuses on this. I want to strongly recommend that to any World War II reader of history or a teacher in history from a student or a teacher perspective. But back to the question, this question moves us beyond the systems and into more psychological human behavior. The Holocaust was not carried out by abstract forces alone, but by individuals operating within a system that normalized, justified, and bureaucratized violence. Propaganda is used with people like Goebbels and other people. Fear obedience to authority, and gradual moral desensitization of all the other kind of people in the roles. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil is not always the result of monstrous individuals, but of ordinary people making choices within powerful structures. The deeper question becomes not just how this happened, but whether it could happen again and what conditions make it more or less likely within this particular period. And this isn't one of those questions that you can have a Socratic seminar debate with your class and still wrestle with today. I always tell students, don't ever think that we are just evolved in our wisdom. We are beyond ever doing that again. And that's why it's so important, along with many other reasons, why we need to continue to study it and wrestle with these particular kind of events as they go forward. So again, a little bit more into this. At the center of the Holocaust here, with Hitler, it has this ideology and this belief of an Aryan master race, the systematic exclusion and eventual destruction of those deemed inferior, especially European Jews. The Holocaust did not begin just all at once. It evolved. It first came exclusion with the Nuremberg laws, which strips Jews of their citizenship and their rights. Then with segregation, when you're forcing Jews into ghettos, for example, like the famous Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, it isolated them from society, not just making them wear the symbols, but to try to get them completely segregated from society. And then eventually deporting millions of them across Europe into different concentration work camps and death camps. Towards the latter half of the Holocaust, you get into the final stage of the mass murder, especially in AP European history. You have like the Wannsee Conference, Nazi officials here. They coordinate what they finally call the final solution, which is the systematic extermination of European Jews. Killing centers are created like Auschwitz, Birkenau. It became sites of industrialized death. Gas chambers are used. Crematoriums are used to burn the bodies, getting rid of as much evidence as they could. And forced labor is done in camps. They're going to be switching over to genocide into this new bureaucratic process. Overall, over 6 million Jews are murdered, along with millions of others, like we said earlier, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, religious enemies, etc. And this was not chaos. It was not random violence. This was organized. It was planned. It was rationalized. It was done by the German Nazi state. And we could ask ourselves, how does a modern, educated society organize and carry out mass murder like this? Wrestling with the Holocaust requires us to move beyond seeing it as simply an event and instead understand it more as a process. One built step by step through laws, institutions, and decisions made by individuals within a government system. The Holocaust reveals how modern tools of bureaucracy, technology, transportation, and record keeping can be used not only for progress but for destruction. It challenges the assumption that education, culture, and modernization inherently lead to moral behavior. Instead, it suggests that under certain conditions, fear, the use of propaganda, obedience to authority, and ideological conviction, ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary evil. The deeper philosophical question, again, is not just how this happened in the past, but whether the structures that made it possible could exist again and what responsibility individuals have when confronted with injustice within powerful tools. Now let's get to the more latter half of the podcast tonight. I knew this episode would be more about an hour, a little over an hour, so you may have to listen to this episode in pieces unless you really like history. And let's go to the end of the war. And again, kind of foreshadowing Unit 9, I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into the Cold War, but let's kind of go there anyway. By 1945, the end of World War II, Hitler's dead, Mussolini's dead, Stalin's still alive, but Europe itself is devastated. Cities will lie in ruins. Infrastructure is destroyed. Many of these countries are broke. Millions of people are dead. Empires have collapsed. But out of all that destruction does shift to a new global world order. And that's going to be between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe is no longer the center of power. I always tell students this. The way the school year has seen from the Renaissance onward is that it seemed like Europe was almost at the center of like a lot of cultural and technological movements around the world, especially whenever you're getting into first wave imperialism and second wave imperialism. But the end of World War II really does start to elicit a complete change in the European superpowers, especially when decolonization is further fueled and done through rising nationalism. Now, the Cold War, this new war from 1945 to 1991, it is not a traditional war. As I tell students, it is an ideological conflict. It is a technological conflict. It is the ideological in a way that it is capitalism versus communism in an economic type of war. It is democracy versus authoritarian communism in a government side of the war. Europe has now become the front line between these two superpowers. And for example, Germany, of course, is divided between France, Great Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. Even the city of Berlin must be divided. And then later on, resulting in the symbol of that division, even more so, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, whenever he builds the Berlin Wall around 1961, and it will not be torn down until 1989. The world in the Cold War, after World War II, is now bipolar. And while the U.S. and the USSR never fight each other directly, they do compete each other through proxy wars, like the Korean War, in which North Korea attacks South Korea, attempting to spread communism. It's one of those aftermaths of World War II that leads to a lot of other issues. A former Japanese colony now taken from them, split between the superpowers. We also see the same thing later on in Vietnam, in which Ho Chi Minh leads his people in order to attack South Vietnam, to try to also get rid of French control from that area as well. We also have the nuclear arms race, the nuclear arms buildup. You have the space race. You have political influence spreading around different areas of the world into the Middle East, into Southeast Asia, into Africa, down into Central South America, everywhere in the world. It's not just a European struggle. That's why the Cold War needs to be taught in an extremely detailed, justified way, not just in AP European history, but in world history. And again, another philosophical question we could do as we wrap up the Cold War kind of short summary look is, what does conflict look like when total war could mean total destruction, especially with the proliferation of nuclear weapons? The Cold War redefines conflict by placing limits on it. With nuclear weapons now, the capability of destroying entire civilizations, we look at this as the acronym MAD, mutually assured destruction. We have the risk of direct war between superpowers now becomes unthinkable. Instead, conflict shifts into proxy wars, or hot wars, as they are called sometimes, political influence and ideological competition. And again, these hot wars could be Korea, Vietnam, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Yom Kippur War. There's lots of different issues that kind of spread off of here. And again, the whole war is driven by mostly ideological competition. This creates a new paradox. Peace is maintained not through trust, but through fear of mutual destruction. It challenges traditional ideas of war and diplomacy, raising the question of whether stability built on fear is truly stable or merely a prolonged tension waiting for a breaking point. And the last little narrative section here that kind of feeds off of the end of World War II and the Cold War is the idea of decolonization, the end of empires. At the same time, European empires around this time period, they begin to start collapsing. Colonies in Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, demand independence. The very ideas of nationalism and self-determination that we saw earlier. Once European spread across the globe. India, for example, will gain independence. African nations such as Ghana and others will rise. Asian countries resist colonial control, most especially Vietnam. And Europe, once the ruler of the world, must now confront a new reality. Its dominance around the world is now ending. So where does that leave us in AP European history? From 1914 to today, Europe and the world has undergone 2 world wars, the rise and fall of totalitarian regimes, the Holocaust, the Cold War, the fear of nuclear weapons, and the decline of European empires. And through it all, one theme remains constant: the tension between power and humanity. Because the 20th century forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Progress does not guarantee morality. Technology does not guarantee wisdom, as we said in the last episode. And power, unchecked especially, can lead to devastation. So as we close this episode, I want you to think about this. History is not just about what happened. It is about what we learn from it. And Unit 8 challenges us to wrestle with the biggest question of all. In a world shaped by war, ideology, and power, what responsibility do we have to ensure history does not repeat itself, or history does not rhyme in the negative ways that we saw it rhyme from Unit 2 or 1 all the way to Unit 8 into this era? Now, wrestling with this overall thematic question for Unit 8 means recognizing that history is not something distant or disconnected from us. It is a reflection of human choices, systems, and values that still exist today. And this is why I so strongly believe in techniques like Socratic seminars in class, because students need to genuinely wrestle with these ideas in a dynamic way. And they could do that also through writing as well. The world, it's shaped by war, ideology, and power in the 20th century did not emerge from nowhere. It was built through decisions made by individuals and governments and societies under pressure, fear, and nationalist ambition. To ensure history does not rhyme in the negative way it does again, our responsibility is not simply to remember events like World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust, but to understand the conditions that made them possible, like unchecked nationalism, blind obedience to authority, economic desperation, and the dehumanization of other people, especially those who are different than us. This philosophical struggle asks us to move beyond passive learning into active awareness, to question power, to recognize early warning signs, and to consider the moral weight of our own choices within society. In the end, the challenge is not whether history will present similar tensions again. It will. But whether we will have the wisdom, courage, and the clarity to respond differently when it does. Now, covering a unit like Unit 8, 20th century global conflicts, as vast and consequential within AP European history, requires an intentional focus not just on what happened, but on why it matters. For both teachers and students, the key is to organize the content, at least I have found, around themes rather than isolated events: power, ideology, conflict, and human behavior. And this is what I mean by taking more of a philosophical method of approach to teaching these overall big events. And I think it makes it a little bit easier to find continuity between these events and other events over time. Instead of trying to memorize everything like a flashcard, anchor your understanding in connections like how World War I leads to instability, how that instability fueled more totalitarianism or into totalitarianism, how ideology then shapes into World War II, and how those outcomes reshape the global order during the Cold War and decolonization into Unit 9. Now, slow down at the most critical moments, like the causes of total war, the rise of fascism, and the Holocaust, and take time to wrestle with them deeply rather than rushing past them. Ask questions, make comparisons, and constantly return to the bigger picture. How do these events connect, and what patterns emerge? Look for trends. Look for ways of doing comparison and contextualization and continuity. Ultimately, mastering Unit 8 is not about covering everything. It's about understanding the threads that tie it all together and develop the ability to think critically about how history unfolds and why it still matters to us today. Again, thank you for joining me in this much longer episode than recently. It'll be a little over 50 minutes. I appreciate all of your support. Episode 71 will be a focused summary narrative on Unit 9, the last unit in AP European History. Then I can start doing more hyper-focused episodes again, more interviews again, more roundtable discussions again, more maybe pop culture topics as well. But I have strongly appreciated your time, your support throughout this podcast and its growth over the last couple of years. So without further ado, continue to question the past in order to understand the present. And as always, be contagious.